Right. Okay. So welcome all. Thanks for joining. Look forward to this conversation. Um, I want to start just because I'm going to presume that some folks have read a little bit of the work that I've posted on System 3, but some may not, and some may not have read at all, and that's of course perfectly fine. So I just want to spend a little time up front talking about what System 3 is, where it came from, before tying it into how it connects to the discussion I started on LinkedIn about design thinking, agile, and human-centered design, which is also partly a topic here. Um, so let me begin with System 3. So System 3 is an idea that I started writing about back in December of last year. It came in part out of research and thinking that I had spent about 9 months of last year doing in connection with thinking about AI and human conversation, and in particular whether and how it might be possible to build an AI that participated in human conversation. And of course, a big part of the thinking is, well, like, what did that mean? What does participation mean? How is that different, for example, from some of the early paradigms of interaction we are seeing with AI? This is actually prior to ChatGPT hitting the streets, so that was a very interesting event, and continues to be. System 3 directly relates to the concept of System 1 and 2 thinking that we know probably best from Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. That book and the broader work that Kahneman did with his longtime research partner, Amos Tversky, is solidly in the background of my thinking. That work primarily had to do with human decision making and judgment, and particularly patterns of error that arise out of the ways in which System 1 and 2 work. System 1 is the fast system, which Kahneman often describes as being both intuitive and automatic, and System 2 is described as a effortful, deliberative system of thinking. And as I was rereading Kahneman last year, it occurred to me that that the account of thinking in System 1 and 2 is very individualistic, and very much centered on, what's become a very normalized paradigm in philosophy of mind, that makes a strong connection between mind and brain, for one thing, and also with mind as something that is a possession of individuals. Individuals have minds, individuals think, and our thinking mixes up when we interact. That said, throughout my professional life, I've observed a very different kind of thinking. Not the only one to observe this, but which I think is distinct. And I think this kind of thinking is more collective. I think it's more emergent. And I don't think that it is strictly something that is only going on in our individual heads, so to put it. And so that kind of thinking, I believe, is paradigmatic when two kinds of human activity are happening: when we're collaborating, at least collaborating in a smooth way, and when we are in conversation of a certain kind. I mean probably more than what we mean when we casually talk about collaboration and conversation, but we can talk more about that. So the association that I've been making in the writing about System 3 is that System 3 thinking is a kind of thinking that happens, arises, emerges in certain conditions of human activity, that we can enter this kind of thinking deliberately, that we don't enter it automatically necessarily. We don't enter it automatically just because we assemble in groups and start talking to each other. Talking to each other in groups is not what I mean by conversation. A conversation, involves a kind of exchange which ultimately I characterize as a state in which three things begin to happen and become characteristic of interaction. One is intimacy, another is immersion, and the third is intent. Okay, so that's a lot of table setting, but that part is done. Before going on any further, any questions just on clarification on any of that? I'm sure you might well have questions further afield about System 3, but I just want to make sure that all that I said just now was clear enough. So if anybody has any questions that are useful to get on the table to clarify things now, that'd be great. Okay, seeing none for the moment, I will go on. Okay, so let me then talk about the conversation I started on LinkedIn that presumably is why many of you got interested in participating in this conversation. Although I expect perhaps not the limit of why you might be interested, but specifically. I wrote a post about something that I had been observing for a long time. There were a couple of things recently that brought it to a head, but it was three kinds of conversation that happened to be going on in areas of practice, and notwithstanding that there's lots of things going on in these conversations, I saw something that looked common, that was going on, at least in certain parts of the conversation. And that was something that looked much more like combat or conflict than it did like conversation. And the conversations or the domains that I made reference to were design thinking, agile, and human-centered design. And if you're tuned in to any of those domains or conversations, then you can't have been a stranger to, a regular flow of occasional posts about why these things are full of shit, broken, garbage, what have you. There's been a lot for a long time about how agile isn't all that it's cracked up to be, or much worse than that, that it's not effective at all, or that it's actually counterproductive. Likewise, design thinking, as much as it's trumpeted by its fans, is equally kicked in the teeth on a regular basis. One of the specific examples I called out was a talk by a woman who's a designer at the very well-known design firm, global design firm called Pentagram, a woman named Natasha Jen, who gave a talk back in 2018 called "Design Thinking is Bullshit," which kind of wears its point of view on its sleeve. And so I wanted to say a couple of things about that talk in particular, what it seems to represent to me. The other thing I'm going to do, just sort of while we're here, I meant to do a little earlier, is I'm putting a link in the chat to a Google Doc, which I hope you have easy access to now, which not only has a little bit of an outline of what I hope to cover today, but also some links and a free invitation to add suggestions, comments, other material, links, etc. If those occur to you either during the conversation or after the fact. Okay, so Natasha Jen gave this talk. It's it's about a 14-minute talk, which I think she originally gave at the 99% conference. At any rate, it happened in the conversation context of a design audience, um, and um, and a bunch of things are clear watching that talk. One is that Natasha Jen really hates the phrase design thinking, and much that it stands for. Also, that she's very smart, that she's very witty, and she does sort of a very good job of pinning to the wall at least a certain version of design thinking. But the thing that strikes me as I've watched it a number of times, including several recently, is what it doesn't do, which is, first of all, it doesn't begin from what an idea, an interpretive principle that I got acquainted with when I was doing graduate work in philosophy, which is an idea from a guy named Donald Davidson, and it's called the principle of charity. And fundamentally, what the principle of charity says, or at least my version of it says, is that when we're listening to somebody, we should consider that we are listening to a person of intelligence and goodwill, right? Until they really prove us otherwise. But that's how we should enter into a conversation with others, treating them as if both they're deserving of our respect, and also that their thinking is deserving of our respect and consideration. And so one of the things that follows from that in practice is, if we start listening to someone with whom we find we're in disagreement, that we make some effort to consider the substance of our disagreement, rather than going to easy answers like, oh, that person's stupid, or that person doesn't understand anything, or the host of other sort of easy lowball kind of criticisms that we might level at a person. So there's that. So the first thing I would say about Natasha Jen's talk is, what it certainly doesn't do, or make any great effort to do, I think, is to take design thinking seriously at all, which, just is what it is. She's under no legal obligation to do so. But it doesn't make, to me, it makes her arguments less compelling. And there are two slides in particular that I think make it super clear, like really what she is up to in this presentation. And one is a slide which is her own definition of design thinking, which ends with the phrase that people claim that it can be applied by anyone to any problem, where anyone is underlined. The other salient, most salient slide to me is one that occurs toward the end of the presentation, and that slide says, "Real designers surround themselves with evidence," right? And I'm pretty sure, if I remember rightly, that the word "real" is also underlined. And if it's not, it needn't be, because it's clear that the stress intended on that word in that sentence intends to underline our attention to there are some kinds of designers, and then there are real designers. Again, both of these things indicate a certain kind of dismissiveness, a certain kind of unwillingness to take seriously certain kinds of people. I guess we're supposed to automatically know who those people are, but at least as far as that talk goes, it seems to apply broadly to anyone who ascribes to design thinking, or thinks that it's a real thing, or something of value. Okay, so look, I mean, people can have opinions and make arguments about whatever they will, of course. But here's really what I wanted to sort of unpack that much about that particular talk to say, which is, it doesn't strike me that what Jen is interested in here or up to here is having a conversation about design thinking. There is not an invitation to, anyone who again thinks of themselves as a design thinker, believes that there's something of merit there, has used design thinking at least as they understand it and found it had value. What if you are any of those things in the context of this thing, you are being dissed and dismissed, um, and um, and so, why should we care about that? We should care about it because, again, in the context of other such apparent conversational gambits, again, in the context of Agile and the context of human-centered design, um, what we see, I think, is not conversation, an attempt to invite people to think together and differently about a particular subject, um, but position taking, position defending, and kind of staged or responsive to sort of turf battle, right? And again, this does not feel conversational, and it doesn't seem to involve or invite the kind of thinking that I'm describing when I talk about System 3. The only kind of reaction that we can have, really, because it's the only kind that's been offered to us, is a reaction, right? We're not really invited to conversation or engagement. So we're not really invited to be thinking with this other person at all. We are being offered their thoughts, they're finished, settled, not up for discussion kind of thoughts. And again, that is what it is. People can play this game, but it's a particular kind of game, and I just want to notice that that it has a game-like quality, and it's a very different kind of game than the game of an open-ended, sincere conversation, right? Um, in which I think there are some things that are characteristic, which we don't find in things like a talk called "Design Thinking is Bullshit," or Agile is garbage, or whatever kind of other kind of dismissive gambit people may be up to in certain things. And I think that part of what's occurred to me is, like, this way of presenting in public has become all too characteristic, right? And in the context of politics or social ideas, as opposed to the domains of practice, this is the interaction paradigm of polarization, um, and in which we have positions squared off against one another. And I don't know about you, but I don't find that kind of interaction productive. I don't find that it leads anywhere except to getting angry, which I don't need any more of that in my life. I don't learn much from that kind of interaction. And I want to learn about the things that I care about. That's in fact why and I think why many of us have and seek out conversation, to learn more than we ourselves know, or are likely to know, to find out or figure out, if left to ourselves, if left to our own limited individual thinking, right? So the desire to have conversation, the opportunity to participate in conversation and what may come of it, is about enlarging our own capacity for thinking, the enlarging literally the capacity of the room, quote unquote, in which we think. Um, so, um, so I think the thing that again strikes me, again, not as something that everybody has to do, but certainly if you were interested in conversation about these things, whether they're design thinking, agile, human-centered design, or anything else that you have strong feelings, and perhaps believe you may disagree with others, but you want to constructively disagree, then how do we, how might we begin to get there by thinking about what these things are differently, right? Um, and the first thing I would say is, rather than, as all of these things are often characterized, and to be fair, often characterized by some of their practitioners. So, like people who get the wrong end of the stick may come by it honestly. Lots of these things are offered up as processes that somehow, I'm going to call them process. Uh, the belief that they are processes of a certain kind suffers from something I'm going to call the alchemical fallacy, which is the belief that if we use certain processes, design thinking, agile, human-centered design, then the outcomes will necessarily be good ones. And I think there's magical thinking involved in that. We can certainly talk about that further if people want to. But I think there's an easy corrective to that way of thinking that loses nothing, of our stake in these conversations, and actually, makes it more likely that talking about these things gets more interesting and goes better. And that is that we treat these things like design thinking, agile, and human-centered design as critical conversations rather than as methodologies, right? And that their purpose, right, is to put us in conversation with others, in this case, other practitioners who we may be involved in work with. And it puts us into a common way of thinking about the work that we do. Right? We might call these things meta conversations because there's sometimes conversations about how we do the things that we do. But it seems to me that as soon as we make that move, we take the air out of the question of these are things about which one can be right or wrong, right? And so I think that is often an important element of creating the conditions for good and productive conversations, is trying to avoid the belief that that someone or group of us has the right or wrong end of something. And what people really need to do is listen to us, and everything will be okay. So I want to sort of do two things to wrap up this part of what I want to talk about. One, I don't know if anybody else saw this, but there was a New York Times article in the last week or so about a campus free speech kerfuffle at Stanford, involving an uninvited speaker who had been invited to campus by one of the societies around the law school, in this case the Federalist Society local chapter, and it was one of these examples of where people take up opposite sides of a free speech divide, disagree radically, and the conversation there is no conversation because it squares off on people taking inflexible positions, right? Either all for or all against something, with very little room created in the middle, for having a conversation about what it is, in fact, that people actually care about or actually think is at stake in conversations about free speech. And so it struck me, and I provided a link to this as sort of another good example of what I see as a missed opportunity. In this case, the dean of the Stanford Law School made a pronouncement about about the school's free speech policy. Again, that policy may and probably does have its merits, but just table dropping it in a context where there might be reasonable disagreement with elements of it seems unnecessarily adversarial. And so last thing I want to close up before then maybe we have some more open conversation is, how do we know that we might or might not have just walked into a conversation in which or an interaction in which system 3 thinking is occurring? So 4 ideas about things that we might use to test the kind of environment we're in. Is there an invitation? Does it feel like a diversity of perspectives is invited by this conversation, whether of a speaker or a group of people? Is there an open question at play in this particular edition of the conversation? Is there something about which we agree that we don't have an answer, but we have an interest? Is there a call to participate? Are we actively invited to be participants rather than spectators? And finally, is there an acknowledged liminal space, an undefined space between perspectives or worldviews, which is to say, are people deliberately accounting for the fact that we come from different places, are equipped with different ways of seeing, understanding, etc., have different reasons for having different things at the foreground of our concern? Does it feel like those things are part of the dynamics and ethics of the conversation? All right. Let me pause there and see if folks have questions or thoughts to add.
I really like the question you posed about how can we tell if System 3 is at play. Austin Wiggins and I worked on a project for meeting design where we were examining Air Force leaders and how they ran meetings, which tends to be very poor. It tends to be kind of a report out and very little interaction. And one of the things we came to was that if you are facilitating the right conditions, conflict emerges. Like, conflict is a healthy and very indicative that, one, there's safety because people don't, engage in conflict if they don't feel safe. And also, it's kind of an indirect heuristic to a lot of those ones that you mentioned, invitation and open question, something to be solved. Is that conflict? And I got it from I read a number of books on meetings and arrived at that as a particularly useful heuristic to use.
Yep. Yeah, I appreciate that, Daniel. I mean, I think that, especially in conversations that are important or important to us, have high stakes of any sort, We should expect and want a certain kind of conflict and disagreement, right? I mean, that is how we understand more broadly different perspectives, and how much room there is in our thinking for those perspectives, and whether that's an indication of adjustment that we need to make, and so on. But and the things about psychological safety, I have more thoughts about that, but yeah, really appreciate that. And for sure, just want to add, in case it's not obvious, certainly nothing about what I'm trying to call out is too much conflict, too much disagreement. That is not what I think is the problem here. It has to do with how people are disagreeing with each other, and why, right? It has to do with the civility and the ethics of conversation rather than the content per se. Other thoughts, things to add, questions?
Hey, Michael, I have a quick question. All of this makes a ton of sense so far. I think what I'm thinking about, maybe you'll get to this a little bit later on. I haven't been able to open that Google Doc yet. Is you talk about sort of that system 3 kind of igniting when you're in that conversation. What do you feel like maybe post conversation, is that like still a liminal space where you're maybe still in that system 3 because you're sort of reflecting on what that conversation, what emerged from that conversation, kind of how that might have changed your mind? You're maybe still thinking about what's going on. Like, are you still in that space, even though you're not in direct conversation, like literally, but you're still
Yeah.
mentally kind of in that area?
No, I really appreciate the question. So so to clarify, for sure there are two sort of ways in which we can and do talk about conversation, one far more common than the other, and the one is the one that is the sort of temporally immediate one, like the one
Right, yeah.
we're having today, right? But many conversations, especially the kinds that we're talking about, are extended in time, right? There's a conversation that was happening before we all walked into the room, and there's a conversation that continues after we all walk out of the room, right? And some of this way of thinking about conversation, and that particular sort of secondary way of talking about conversation, comes directly from work that I did when I was a PhD student, but also in my professional work in communities of practice. Right, and communities of practice are often defined and organized around a conversation they're having, right? And again, there's this larger sense of what that conversation is. So, I mean, I think, for example, user experience is a conversation, right? As well as a practice. That conversation is not only a part of the practice, it's at the very heart of creating a practice, but also in terms of moderating that practice in a variety of ways on an ongoing basis. And we could use other examples. Does that answer the question, Elsa?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that example is really helpful. Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about just, I guess that example is super helpful. And I love that sort of idea that, yeah, both practice and actual conversation is happening. So cool. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, for I appreciate that question, Elsa. Just to unpack it like one stage further, again, some of the specific background that I brought to this has been that I did a lot of research in two big communities of practice, law and areas of science, and those are practices which function largely through conversation, And there are two things that are highly characteristic about both of those areas of human practice. One, those things are fundamentally unfinished, which is to say, they are both constantly in search of the truth, the best truth at any given time, in any given sort of field of investigation and pursuit. And furthermore, the practice is constantly open to criticism and revision. So there is always an active conversation about whether we're getting it right in any particular context or case, and the possibility that we change our minds, sometimes in dramatic ways, about things that used to be core to our understanding or practice. Those things, too, I think are characteristic of the kind of thinking that I want to call System 3, and why I think it's important and worthwhile that we pay attention to this as a distinct kind of thinking.
That's awesome. I love that. Thank you for elaborating on that. I know Lauren question because they've had their hand up for a little bit.
Lauren,
I've just been talking, so I'll let Lauren jump in.
No, you're next in queue, Lauren, please.
That was perfectly fine, Elsa. I was enjoying your question as well, so not a problem to be patient and wait. Michael, my question revolves around my background in education and learning features. And so when I look at these elements of System 1, 2, and 3, I see a correlate with a neurological function. Do you see any, I mean, obviously we don't need to have being an MRI machine to tell whether or not we are having System 3 conversation with someone. Right. But would it advance this process if there was a neurological correlate that said, this is this is that, and that is another?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect so, since, right, neurology and that particular branch of science, has come to both have a certain currency and a certain credibility in all kinds of conversations, right? I mean, so to your point, right, I think if we all understand, as you seem to intuitively enough, or however you're getting there, what I mean by System 3, you said, like, we don't need a PET scan to know that we're in a System 3 way of thinking, or a System 3 state or environment. Do I believe that that this would show up neurologically? I sure do. I don't. I mean, I'll caveat that by saying, I'm a person who certainly acknowledges that the brain is an absolutely important organ in cognition, but it's not the only human organ or system that's involved in cognition. And there's a lot of other stuff worth paying attention to, which is not to say that neurology isn't worth paying attention to. So, I don't know enough about neuroscience that has been done, or if neuroscience has been done around the System 1 and 2 paradigm. I suspect that there is probably already evidence without these particular optics that we could go find and correlate certain kinds of activity to evidence of certain kind of brain states. Csikszentmihalyi work around flow states, for example, right? I mean, this has for sure been studied and thought about in neurological contexts. It's a big part of certain cognitive states in that people attain through high performance physical activity and sport. Again, very, very studied. So I'd be surprised if there weren't some evidence already that we could find and correlate, but good question.
I think more directly, Michael, the question would be, do you, in the process that you're working with, see any value to knowing the neurological?
100% I do. I mean, I think that what goes in our brains goes on in our brains is part of what's going on in our system. I think neurology provides real evidence of things. I think that can only augment and make richer and more robust our conception and thinking about this stuff. So yeah, for sure, I would be excited to learn anything, right, positive or negative, from that kind of source. Peter, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah. Going a different direction. You mentioned both human-centered design and design thinking, which the value I see with respect to System 3 is that they are they help create context for better conversations.
Yep.
And I'm wondering how you think about when I first read about System 3, or think about conversations, we think of the magic of the spark of 2 or 3 people just playing off of each other. And I'm wondering how you think of intent in creating structures and spaces to enable this, and just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts in that direction. We've heard about safety. Obviously, safety is important, but just like, what is the role of designing these conversations, and how does that interplay with System 3?
Fantastic question. And I think the question of what are the design conditions, what are the design levers that are both available to us, and which are likely to promote System 3 thinking, right? Which is not a mode of thinking that we need to be in all the time. Let's touch on that. So I think for sure, Amy Edmondson's concept of psychological safety, is a textbook example, but one among others. But let's just unpack it for a minute, because Daniel brought it up as well, and I'm sure other people have some of that on their minds. And one of the things that I think is super important about that Amy Edmondson's idea and the work that sort of opened up her thinking to this idea in the first place, to go back to something Daniel said, is, safety does not mean the creation of conditions in which there is no conflict or no disagreement. To the contrary, right? It is meant to create conditions which make it possible for us to take our greatest risks, right? Because we're secure in the environment, right? Because we don't fear punishment for our behavior. The intent, right, as I hope we all understand, is that creates, in a way, more oxygen in the room, precisely for conflict and disagreement, and for sticking with it, right? And this is another thing which I've been doing a lot of thinking about and looking for good examples of, and happy to hear about this from folks if they've got good ones. Disagreeing and having conflict is not something lots of us turn out to be super great at. And the more we care about something, and the more we feel things are at stake for us, personally or more broadly, the harder things get, right? Because we get emotional, and part of that is fine. I'm not sort of trying to suggest that we shouldn't be emotional, but it takes practice to get into high stakes, high energy conversation that involves conflict and disagreement, and have that go well, right? And have it go better than well. But it's like super necessary to working through and with complexity of any kind, I think, right? One of the things, and maybe you'd have something to say about this in particular, but I know that you among, you know, an identifiable group of other folks that I know, are people who did a lot to help define certain fields and ways of working and ways we have of understanding certain kinds of work, like user experience, information architecture, and so on, things that didn't have words or descriptions, right, 25 years ago. And those things were created, you know, through conversation, and I know that there was real conflict and disagreement in those conversations, some of which, you know, got very adversarial and probably not so productive, and other parts of which, you know, got productive precisely because they were able to get frictional. So I'd maybe turn it back to you and ask you if you have any, you know, things that stick out to you as places where you saw this go better rather than worse when either was maybe possible.
Not offhand though. As you were saying that, I was thinking about something I saw. I was a week and a half ago at a conference where one of the speakers was encouraging the people in attendance who advocate for their function within their organizations. When we tend to advocate for our functions within organizations, say design or user experience, etc., we find ourselves in a mode of persuasion. How can I convince someone else that I am valuable? And she said, don't do that. Don't persuade, negotiate. Try taking on a negotiation frame where it's not about I'm convincing you that I am valuable, but there's some almost like diplomacy quid pro quo happening as part of the as the frame of the conversation, as opposed to bringing you to my side. Because when I think about developing professional identity, I think it's a lot more about negotiation than I do about persuasion. And how do you get to some good enough space that everyone's fine enough with it, and then we can like set it aside and move on, because that's also probably not the focus, is creating an identity. The focus is like doing the work or creating the community. Anyway, that's where my thinking went in this conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, I just see a bunch of stuff in the chat about sort of disentangling system 1, 2, and 3. So, Daniel, was your hand raised relative to any of that, or?
It was in relation to something Peter just said. That was about some of the universal underlying protocols of what.
Okay. Can we put a pin in that and try to help out folks, because I don't want folks feeling lost. So let me try to run back through system 1, 2, and 3, and then open that up now with lots of confusion on the table to questions that may be further clarifying. So the first thing that I should say is, you know, system 3 is an idea of mine that I am still very much in the midst of unpacking. So, like, you know, that there is already the possibility of you know, fuzzy edges. You know, it's highly probable that there are. So your help in helping me clarify that stuff, much appreciated. Let me just start backing up into system 1 and 2. You know, system 1 and 2 are again the systems which Danny Kahneman described as fast and slow. System 1 being fast, system 2 being slow. In particular, his work and his research and the work that he did with Amos Tversky was very focused on decision making and judgment, making judgments, and often the experimental context, because they did a lot of experimental work, as did many others, ultimately, was around reasoning about certain kinds of problems, and a lot of them turn out to be problems of statistical reasoning that involve either math or mathematical judgment in the thinking, and so System 1. Again, the FAST system, which Kahneman describes as being both intuitive and automatic. Think of that kind of thinking as the thinking that you do when you have gut reactions to things, when you have a sort of instant sense of the answer to a question, and so there. I think about sort of two ways of thinking about System 1. We have all kinds of System 1 thinking buried in us that helps us navigate the world every day, right? That helps us in very quick ways understand where we are, what we're doing, what to do next, right? That is information stored as pattern. That is think about systems for signage in public spaces, right? There is, literally a language and systems, and an attempt to make some commonality in that, and we learn that stuff through experience, and then it becomes available to us on an ongoing basis, through quick System 1 intuition. Right. So when we're in an environment and we see a red sign at the top of the door, we don't even really have to read the word to know that it's probably an exit sign. Right. That kind of very quick intuitive thinking is evidence that System 1 is active. Okay. System 2 is a way of thinking that that Kahneman describes as effortful, deliberative. And in he sometimes says things like this. I will say it. System 2 is the way we think about thinking, the way we get more reflective about a thought that we've had, or something we don't understand, something we get stuck on. And I see your hand. Is that Lauren? Did you raise your hand again? I'll loop back.
I did. I was trying to hit the
Okay.
microphone button.
Okay, no problem. Okay, but at any rate, system 2 is that kind of thinking that we're doing when we're trying to work out something that we don't understand, right? That may or may not be something that's come up in our System 1 experience, but think of it as deliberative, reflective, and one of the things that Kahneman includes in his characterization of System 2 is that it's effortful, that it's something that we have to struggle with to do, and I think he means to capture this sense of of what it emotionally and sort of intellectually what it's like to feel stuck in trying to understand something, right, and sort of back out from it and try to look at it and be careful about it and try to sort of work it out, right? So that's System 2. Now, the way that I got to, first of all, thinking about System 3 at all was, it occurred to me that the kind of thinking that I feel is going on when we're collaborating or when we're in a certain kind of conversation isn't well described by System 1 and 2 as an optic. And so I literally, as I was about to get on a conversation with somebody who would sort of provoke some of this thinking unbeknownst to them, came up with the phrase in my head, I think we need a System 3. And that's sort of where my thinking on this started, right? So System 3 is, first of all, as an idea, intended to offer us a way of thinking about a kind of thinking that we do that I don't think is covered by System 1 and 2. So is that part clear? Like, so you know, we could disagree about whether I'm right or wrong about this. You know, there may be some folks who say, hey, you know, what you're talking about as System 3, you know, is just a mix-up of System 1 and 2 with multiple people involved. And we could talk about that. I don't think that's correct, but that certainly could be a point of view. And again, you know, we've had a couple, you know, Lauren, just when you were asking, and Peter sort of got a little bit to this as well. You know, what is the phenomenon of being inside System 3 like? Okay, so let me try to offer you some examples that hopefully will resonate with some of your own experience, right? If you can think of getting into a conversation in which you know, what the conversation is about starts to become much more important than your place in the conversation. And for whatever reason, one of the examples that comes to mind is the kind of conversations I used to have with groups of people after going to a movie, right? Particularly a movie that you got interested in and had a lot to talk about. You know, that kind of conversation very quickly stops being in our own experience of participation about our particular point of view in this one track that we're on about our own thoughts, and very much more about the immersion in the thinking that people are doing together, right? In part because we're thinking about something that we all just had an experience of that we didn't entirely get, or feel like maybe we didn't get all of. And part of the purpose and part of the effort and fun of those kinds of conversations is getting this bigger perspective, right? And this bigger perspective is something that I think we're making together. So I saw someone use the phrase co-creative in the chat just now. Yeah, co-creative. System 3 is a kind of thinking that we do together, right? It is necessarily something that involves more than just yourself, right? It involves interaction with other, I'm just going to say other minds. I don't here just mean other brains. And I say other minds rather than other people because I think it's possible to be involved in System 3 thinking, interacting with the thoughts of others, which can come at us through other form of media. Like I think it's possible to be engaged in System 3 when we're reading, or when we're watching a film or a performance. You know, I think we can be in yeah. Anyway, okay. So hope that clarifies some things. Really interested in remaining pieces of confusion, and please don't be shy because very likely the confusion is on me. So there are no dumb questions about this. Probably just my dumb explanations. Yes, Claudia. Good to see you, Claudia. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Thank you. I just wanted to share my experience around doing this work. So my company does, and my firm does engagement work with government officials and agencies.
Good.
So I've been working a lot with the TPS in Canada, which is the Toronto Police Services, and also Peel Regional Police, and trying to get particularly marginalized communities to engage with police, and also to really move the needle. One of the barriers to the discussion was this concept that we talk, or the community talks, people pretend to listen, and then the same thing gets repeated.
Yeah.
So then there's also almost, if you look at media, you look at the history, particularly with Black communities, there's a narrative of you automatically need to be in an adversarial, reactionary position with police, right? That's the historical narrative
Sure.
that should be reproduced. To break that, which would, I think, Michael, please correct me, that would be what you consider system ones. My practice is in co-design, so I don't really use that terminology 1, 2, and 3. So I'm fast.
Yeah.
So what I recognize in many of the engagements and strategies that I've worked with is that have, one, the reports that I put out actually have legs because it's a negotiation right through, and the operational stakeholders actually negotiate with, and we say, okay, this is an outcome.
Yep.
But what I find is that there needs to be an evolution of the conversation. Like, you can't just walk in and say that there's going to be the first, because no one's really listened in the first round.
Yeah.
And then there has to be an evolution of power sharing in the conversation where people let their guard down. And then there's the power of the conversational echo where people actually listen when no one else is in the room, right? And I think the facilitator actually helps that. I mean, I spend about 100 to 250 post-conversational one-on-ones to see where the gaps, the connectivity gaps were, and where the actual link is, like where people thought there was a gap and there was no gap. There was actually a language use or something else, but it was actually, they were on the same page. And then the final piece was the evolution of intimacy in a conversation. And those are the things that drive, in my experience, change, because who you thought the monster was at the beginning might turn out to be your friend. And what many people realize in the community, say in the Black community that I've been working with, is that there is no benefit for the Black community to be in a reactionary adversarial position with police. They lose. It's automatic. It's great for television. It's great for media, but it's not great for the community. And so to create, how do you break those barriers that actually breaks down listening, is actually creating those pathways of intimacy. And what does that look like, especially when you need to break through the system one, I believe, which is we're supposed to naturally be in this adversarial position. So I don't think that solves anything, but
no, that's great. So thank you for the example, Claudia. I mean, like super excited to hear you're doing that work. And I think as an example, it's a great one, and it's why I care about this thinking, and it's why I want others to care about it, right? Because to your point, if we can't figure out how to enable people in the context like the one you described, think together, right? We won't get to understanding. We won't get, let alone to change, right? So one of the things we have to recognize, and which you very well described, is, like we enter that room, of the conversation that you're describing, arriving from very different worlds, right? And if we stay stuck in those worlds and only in those worlds, then we're fixed with the dynamics of those opposing worlds, right? Which you described in this case as adversarial, and it takes real work on all sides, right, to take what's out of the way, to take out just the single dimension of the community versus the institution. And one of the reasons that things like intimacy, are important, I think, levers here, is, we, I think, become much more able and likely to solve especially hard problems when we care about the people who we're trying to work to solve them with, right? And the corollary is, I think things go very badly if we don't do that, right? I mean, so now if we don't do that, we're both working with the dynamics of our community versus police dynamic, right, which was already adversarial. Now we're working with a personal dimension of that, which is, I think you're a bag of shit because you're wearing a uniform, and I think you're just in my way to do my job because you're from the community, and you're the element I'm trying to control. So I think bang on, and I think like the way you describe the context and the dynamics of the context, that's how this stuff is different. That's why it matters.
And I don't want to take up any more time too much, but one of the tricks that I used was that to flip the adversarial
Yep.
and reactionary was to create a subject matter that was futuristic,
Yep.
that allowed for the room of collaboration.
Yep.
So instead of talking about police and use of force, and I talked about AI and
Yep.
policing.
Yep.
So now it's something in the future that now that we're creating a statement of principle of how AI should be used, which opens up the field, but
Yep.
it also makes the community be inclusive. So really creating that context where you take people out of a reactionary position and put them in a futuristic position so that they have to work together to reach an aim. So I just wanted to add that in, and thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you. Warren, you've had your hand up. Thank you.
Sure. Great talk, and I think thank you for your patience, because this is getting much more clearer for me.
Oh, good.
One thing I thought that might help. Have you heard of appreciative inquiry?
Yeah.
Okay. And so in the line of work that I do, I have to bring together in a very short amount of time international defense executives who are inherently pissed off at each other based on tribal, religious, national, super fundamental things that we in the first world can't even begin to appreciate.
Yep.
And as this famous guy Daniel Halter once said, how important facilitation is, because it's crucial that we set those the right or ask the right questions, set the right examples, make the right assumptions, make this environment where you could be super open. Like, for instance, as an American, I've had to be very sensitive. Claudia, I'm sure you can appreciate this, to colonialism. I never thought I'd have to talk about it, but now that I've been schooled on it, I have to be very open to it. And so my point is getting these tendrils in the beginning is super difficult and super crucial. And if you can do that, you're like halfway home. And then let's skip over the middle part, because you're going to do what you're going to do and use a framework or methodology or have your meeting and whatnot. And then at the end, to what Elsa is saying here is completely, of course, true, is that the vision, right? What's the mission that you're working on? For us in the military, we almost have it easy because we are so focused on mission and what's it going to take. So we at least know we have to get there. We might not agree on it or how we get there, but we're super focused on that. And so when you're bringing together these international people who are fighting for the same resources or whatever, it's super difficult to figure out how might we, see a future to engender global peace and stability, right? But yet have practical, okay, you're going to go home in 2 weeks and you need to tell the boss, here's steps 1, 2, and 3. This is what we're going to do and help our country, emerge from global, famine and other things. So it's this beginning and end. If I don't have a prototype here, but I'm thinking of this like helix DNA looking thing where it's super frazzled on the bottom at the beginning, and it's super clear on the top, and you just have to go through this process. And I think that's what we're all trying to do. We're find these frameworks and these models. How do we get there? How do we get there in the shortest amount of time for the least amount of money for the customer in the most effective way? So anyway, I'm just reflecting.
No, appreciate all that, Warren. So just to the point of at the top of what you said about the role and power of facilitation, right? I link this back to Peter's question about designing for conversation, right? I mean, facilitation and tools that facilitators have or become practiced in, right, are one of the ways in which we can introduce not just design into conversation, but design tools that become available through the facilitator to everyone, right? And I think, again, thinking about contexts that both you and Claudia described, you know, one of the things that I think, you know, we always need to be asking ourselves, and when we know we're going in the right direction or not, is the people we invited got a route in to participate. Do they see themselves as able to participate? Does it look like their desire to participate is going well or not, right? And if it's not, what is our role, you know, whatever our position in the conversation, in helping that go better, right? And again, right, the three, if you remember, the three sort of eyes that I want to see as cultivated and designing for these things, you know, to maximize the depth and value of System 3: intimacy, immersion, intent, right? Intimacy makes us open to connect, and it takes out of our way, although this is an effort, right, something we have to work at, takes out of our way some of the things that will make us defensive, or limit our ability to hear others, as well as to say what we have to say in ways that are more likely to be heard, right? Immersion, we got to be in this, right? When we're in a room or an environment in which you know, we're meant to be invested and others are meant to be invested, you know, we really have to be there. What does that look like? And finally,
right.
you know, System 3 thinking means that the thinking that we're doing has shared intent, even if, you know, our particular position in the thinking may be different from that of others, right? We're trying to get somewhere together. We're trying to work on something together. So thank you for that. I saw both Christian and Chris Finley had hands up. So Christian, yours I think was up first. So please
Yes,
jump.
cool. Can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good. My question is like, I'm just curious for your perspective, maybe anyone on this call's perspective, but like I work in a very collaborative business where it's sort of just collaborative work is key to what we do. I think one of the questions we've been asking ourselves and struggling with, frankly, for a few years is like, to what extent does this kind of System 3 mode of operating rely on like being in the same room together?
Mhm.
Because we used to be very much a sort of like get in a room, get on a whiteboard, really like look people in the eye. We did a lot of, you know, business travel. We would do things in person, right? And as we've shifted to a hybrid and we use tools like this, we've been having debates for years about like, is this a flat experience? Can I actually truly like groove with another human being and solve problems with them through Slack and through some of these other things, right? So I guess I'm just, and frankly, I have seen evidence both in our work and in other things where sometimes there are digital platforms that actually do forge these really kind of like flow state relationships between people, but they're very, very rare. So I guess I'm just curious what your take on is like, is it one, do you believe it's possible?
Yep.
And what are some just thoughts on like best practices for achieving in this world, right?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's an important and timely question because, you know, we are likely of necessity, many of us, to find ourselves having to negotiate those constraints, whether we want to or not. And so, so let me first start by saying, you know, I tend to believe that the optimal conditions for System 3 thinking involve face-to-face interaction. The spectrum and fidelity of the ways in which we communicate and can communicate are just so much broader in face-to-face communication for all kinds of reasons, right? That said, can we do this kind of thinking across distances? For sure we can. We can not only do them across distances, we can do them across time. And we do constantly. When we think to remind ourselves of how new distance collapsing communication technology is, right? I mean, way back from what we're talking about, just to phones, right? The ubiquity of phone conversation, not that old, right? People used to communicate over distances about things like this through letters, with like post that was carried by animals. This is how all kinds of collaborative work, like let's just think about science, and various other knowledge domains, until the sort of early parts of the 20th century, were being accomplished that way. And for sure, the availability of distance collapsing technology, created all kinds of change in there. But so I think there are good reasons for thinking that there's reasons for optimism, right? I think how we use technology always matters, right? And I think that one of the very easy mistakes that we're making, and being invited to make by technology, like this, right, is in a kind of system one tripped up way, right? Being able to see each other like this, right, is kind of a mimic of being in a room together, right? And so we can easily sort of just assume that we are in a room together and sort of try to behave as if we are in a room together, but we're not, right? And there's all kinds of stuff that we're missing because we're not. Now, can we design ways of being more present in environments like this? For sure we can. I'm sure all of you have had at least one, hopefully more, experience where somebody thoughtful, prepared a group of people to be in an environment like this, and you felt the difference of having been prepared. Some of the ways in which we can prepare folks, and I'm very interested in other experiences that people have had that they found, useful, powerful, is by things that we do before we even show up, right? This is something that we know from facilitation of any kind, right? Is the better prepared that people are for what might happen or what they might want to happen or might be possible to happen, right? Before they even get there, great. The more they can know about who else is coming, particularly people they don't know, the more chances there are to be familiar in certain ways that give us comfort, that give us interest. Somebody mentioned, Claudia, was your mention of the trick of putting the future on the table, right? Which gives us something. The powerful thing always about that is none of us know what the future is. So now we're all equal, right? We're equally positioned relative to the future, and therefore we can. It's not something about which we can disagree about the facts of. There are no facts about it, so it's opened up a space of possibility, and that's really powerful. Ways in which we can signal to each other that we have interests in common, values in common. Again, also, bring us with a sense of kind of pre-wired safety and ease and comfort. One of the things that I try to do as often as possible is to create curiosity. If people enter into any kind of conversation about anything with their curiosity switches turned on, things will go better. I think almost everything goes better, right? Creating the space to learn about each other, in ways that feel like off the path of the topic, right? Often is just making room for the complexity of understanding, hearing, seeing more about the topic, frankly. So
Yeah, that's super good. And I just wanted to just add one more thing, which is I totally agree with all that. It's cool. I think it's important for us to acknowledge though that like these tools that we use, most of them are designed around efficiency. And in fact, like the entire practice of UX is about removing friction, which then does not get, I think, what you were saying is like sometimes human interactions are built on friction or they're built on these things. And so it's just interesting to say like, I love all the methods that you talked about and what Claudia talked about. That's the thing we do quite a bit as well. It's like, let's not focus on the thing. Let's focus on something over here that we can all move toward, whether it be future. And I think all that, but I just think it's worth acknowledging that I'm totally into this idea of like system 3 thinking, that actually the tools that we use are designed to circumvent that, actually to in many cases like reduce our humanity into very simple interactions. And so we have to take that extra effort, like you were saying, to sort of pre-prepare ourselves to basically to battle the technology that connects us, right? In some way. So, but yeah, thank you for that answer. I appreciate it.
yeah, no, for sure. And before we go on to a couple more questions, just the observation, about technology, its intent and limitations insofar as it may frustrate certain things. Technology is also remarkably plastic, right? And we have and do continually figure out how to do things with technology that it was never intended or designed to do. And so there's optimism in that, I think. And that's a double-edged sword too. I mean, a lot of folks felt and feel like we remember a time when Twitter felt like one of the best conversational technologies, on the planet. And now I think those of us who used to think it's a nonstop dumpster fire, right? So, and the very worst place to go if what you want is human conversation. So, yeah. Warren, I see you've got your hand up again. Before I go back to you, Chris Finley had his hand up if he's still around and wants to say something. Chris, are you still there?
Yeah, hey, I was in a place to go on camera before, so apologies for not jumping on. Speaking of building authenticity and systems 3 like trust, always prefer it. But I certainly enjoy the conversation. Unfortunately, I missed the opening, so I'm not sure what the exact framing is. What I noticed is that you touched on a number of things regarding other different approaches to collaboration, not just the 1 and 2, but sorry, I've sort of let my mind wander with the conversation.
No,
but making distinctions between some of the other boy, and I really had a little list of them as you're going, between some of the other tools or frameworks that exist out there. Whether it's I guess what's the difference between system 3 and conversation, right? I've always been a super fan of the way you've talked about conversation, setting the conditions, and flow. That was one of the ones you brought up. A lot of what you're describing sounds like how I might describe flow. So, like in our conversation the other day, I'm a little bit dumb, but smart enough to get what you're talking about, I think. And so what I'm always inclined to do is how do I boil it down so I can take it in to do the work or to recognize when I'm in this conversation.
Yeah.
I know you're in development and exploration, which is great, but it's maybe a next piece for your entries on Medium.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. And one of the things that for sure, is something that I've got to think about doing is making some kind of an inventory or map or what have you of a variety of ideas which are either related to part of instances of examples of system 3, right? I mean, system 3, right, has two things, right? It's got this reference to Kahneman's work in system 1 and 2, and it's also something of an empty vessel that I'm filling with stuff. And things like flow for sure are a component. I'm trying. Just there's also an extensive literature on things like collective intelligence, distributed intelligence, distributed cognition, and some of these ideas have a lot of crossover. So first of all, I don't think I'm the only or first person to think of any of this stuff. For sure, I'm not. And it is on me as I continue to elaborate this, especially if I intend it to be useful, and I certainly want it to be, to provide ways of understanding, as you're saying, how these other things fit. Why maybe it's useful to have a container or an umbrella to bring these things under, but also how to do some of the work of interrelating them in ways that help us understand more. I take your feedback as good homework. So thank you, Chris. Warren, did you have another go?
I was just responding to what Christian Erickson was saying, and I'm watching what everyone's saying online, Chris and Elsa and everybody. Christian, my perspective is, Michael used the term intimacy. I think the term I would use is trust. I think it's probably one and the same. Building that trust is so crucial, and it's unbelievably difficult in a short amount of time. So to your question, how do you do it online? I completely agree. It's easier in person, right? The one thing we can do that's very difficult to do over technology is have people laugh and have people cry, because that transcends cultural backgrounds, etc. Right? We actually measure how successful we are. We have the after action reports, blah, 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 whatever, reports to the boss. The true essence of when we find success is the number of people that have a breakdown during our 2-week class. That's when we know we've reached somebody, right? And so it's super difficult. So on technology, the best thing that we found is using whatever video conferencing tool you use, Zoom, Teams, whatever. But the key part is not, sure, it's nice to see each other, is breaking them down into smaller groups, right? So there's 14 of us here, and I don't want to take over the conversation and then we're all trying to be polite, but it's super difficult with 14. If we had 4, people would be more willing to speak up, whatever. So if you're forced to go online, just doing that alone does wonders, on top of using Mural and interactive tools and all that I'm sure you're aware of. But that's where we found the most success given the circumstances. Michael, back over to you.
Earlier on the chat, Elsa used the phrase emotional intensity. Elsa and I work together, actually, and that's been one of our sort of catchphrases, is you have to bring emotional intensity to what you're doing in order to create these kinds of relationships, right?
Yeah, yes, and also I would add to that simplicity. Again, in my line of work, I have to be incredibly simple because there's language barriers and all sorts of stuff. So if I do nothing else after 2 weeks, if I have people say 3 things, yes, and, which kind of captures design thinking, yes, and how might we change? Literally, if you just walk out with those couple words, we're already on the road to success, because it is so super difficult. Everyone's wrapped up in their lives. They've got family issues when they go back Monday morning. I get that. And trying to sustain that and keep it going. We get to cheat in the US government because, for instance, our clients, our students, we completely pay for them. All of us, us taxpayers, pay for them to come, which is an impossibility for anybody in the private sector. It's not feasible. Yeah. But so that's a good start. Anyway, Michael, back to you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So folks, it is 1:33. We've been going at this for 90 minutes, which is amazing. So I appreciate that investment from everyone. I do want to respect everybody's time, and the thing that's starting to go on more loudly than it was in my stomach, and perhaps in yours as well. So I just want to sort of get to landing the plane in the humanness of all of this. So first of all, thank everyone. Really appreciate the conversation. Really appreciate that we got to make it a conversation. This is always, you know, the challenge of this medium for me is how to make something conversational. That's something I want to keep working on. I think, you know, if you got this invitation, you know, you also, I hope, got the signal that this was a prototype of something that I'm interested in doing regularly. So please be on the lookout for that. It would be great if it was something that people were interested in participating in on a regular, semi-regular basis, because you know, like, this is not about me trying to get an audience for my own thinking. This is about my trying to get access to people who want to think about this stuff, who are already thinking about it and working on it in their own practice. And that we have something to share. That's why I'm writing about this, but also because I really do care, as I sense that everyone who's spoken today do, as well as evidence in the chat. You know, that we're trying to do work that equips people better and differently for doing hard things, and that is really important work. And so appreciate your coming. Thanks for the time. Thanks for spending the time. Please, if you're not connected on LinkedIn already, please do that. And I encourage folks to connect with each other if you've seen people in the conversation who are out of your network for now, but a chance to make your network a little bigger. All right. Thanks all. Next time.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks.
Good to see you. This was excellent.
Thanks, Daniel. Ciao.
See you.